we'd like to sing a song to God today. This is directly to Him, so thanking Him for everything that we have, basically. It's called Way Down Deep. This old highway of heartache is rocky and rough. I learned a long time ago, but you can't build a fire in the ashes of love, and roses don't bloom in the snow. Down deep inside my soul, where once it was gold and dark, I feel your love take a hold, way down deep in my heart. You put my light on the darkest of days, through storms that were raging within. Then slowly but surely the clouds rolled away, and the sun started shining again. Down deep inside my soul, where once it was gold and dark, I feel your love take a hold, way down deep in my heart. Down deep inside my soul, where once it was gold and dark, I feel your love take a hold, way down deep in my heart. Down deep inside my soul, where once it was gold and dark, I feel your love take a hold, way down deep in my heart, way down deep in my heart.
Wow.
You guys, that was great.
Thank you.
I'm going to read Ecclesiastes chapter 4. It's one of my favorite books in the Bible. I love the wisdom literature of the Old Testament. This is one of those books. Solomon writes, "Again, I saw all the oppressions that are practiced under the sun. Look, the tears of the oppressed, with no one to comfort them. On the side of the oppressors there was power, with no one to comfort them. And I thought the dead who have already died more fortunate than the living who are still alive. But better than both is the one who has not yet been, and has not seen the evil deeds that are done under the sun. Then I saw all the toil and all skill and work come from one person's envy of another. This also is vanity and a chasing after the wind. Fools fold their hands and consume their own flesh. Better is a handful with quiet than 2 handfuls with toil and chasing after wind. Again, I saw vanity under the sun, the case of solitary individuals without sons or brothers, yet there is no end to all their toil, and their eyes are never satisfied with riches. For whom am I toiling, they ask, and depriving myself of pleasure? This also is vanity and unhappy business. 2 are better than 1, because they have a good reward for their toil. For if they fall, one will lift up the other, but woe to one who is alone and falls and does not have another to help. Again, if two lie together, they keep warm, but how can one keep warm alone? And though one might prevail against another, two will withstand one. A threefold cord is not quickly broken. Better is a poor but wise youth than an old but foolish king who will no longer take advice. One can indeed come out of prison to reign, even though born poor in the kingdom. I saw the living who, moving about under the sun, followed that youth who replaced the king. There was no end to all those people whom he led. Yet those who came later will not rejoice in him. Surely this also is vanity and a chasing after wind. I don't know why, but when I read this chapter, it reminded me of a song of my teenage years. There was a band called Depeche Mode, and they had a song called People Are People. And one of the lines in the song are, people are people, so why should it be you and I should get along so awfully? And the song makes you wonder why we oftentimes feel so compelled and justified treating people with indifference. And there's an underlying motive that, as at work, energizing all of these kind of actions, that Solomon draws our attention to in the chapter. There's really four things that he brings out here that brings about misery, that keep people from enjoying the life they were given by God. The first one he hones in on is oppression. In verses 1 through 3, there's nobody to comfort the oppressed. And then the second thing he brings our attention to from verse 4 through 6 is this general lack of contentment that we have in life. The third thing is loneliness, and he kind of encourages cooperation within a community, not alienation from one another. And then the last one is just complete indifference towards other people. Complete indifference. The overarching theme of the chapter seems to be this lack of contentment that results in never being satisfied in life. And one of those results is the complete indifference in which we treat one of God's greatest sources for our enjoyment and contentment in life, people. In the end, people in our life matter. There's no adequate substitute for them. A friend and I were talking last night on our way home from a concert. I was in St. Louis last night, and we were talking about death and dying. And I talked to them about my experience in hospice and how I'd worked in hospice for so many years. And my first year, I was not prepared, was not mentally prepared for the experience of seeing people suffer in the capacity that they were suffering. And then I said, you know, I learned to reframe this, and I have a placard in my office, the 5 remembrances. It's a Buddhist sutra that it talks about. There is, I am of the nature to grow old. There's no way to escape growing old. I am of the nature to experience ill health. There's no way to escape experiencing ill health. I am of the nature to die. There's no way to escape that. Everyone I love and everything that matters to me is of the nature to change, and there's no way for me to escape being separated from them. My actions are my only true belonging. I cannot escape the consequences of my actions. And so I shared those ideas with them, and we were talking about how the people in our life matters, and what does it look like to die a good death? And I said, you know, I got to thinking in my hospice experience that it's not so much about what happens afterwards, because that's still a mystery. We have these ideas and we have our faith, and we have these certain convictions of what we think it's going to be like, but nobody knows for certain. I said, I look at dying a good death as being in the presence of those you love and those who loved you back. That's dying a good death. People in our life matter, and there's no adequate substitute for them. And so as we consider this chapter, notice the various scenarios that Solomon draws out to show us the dangers of looking for contentment in things, in ideas. In these couple of paragraphs here, he observes all of the evils that have been perpetrated on one another in verses 1 through 3 of chapter 4. He's connecting these thoughts with some of his previous observations that he made in chapter 3, verse 16. In chapter 3, verse 16, he said, moreover, I saw under the sun that in the place of justice, even there was wickedness, and in the place of righteousness, even there was wickedness. Oppression and injustice are perpetrated in the world, even in the places and structures and systems that are designed to overthrow atrocities. We're being led to see the experience of human depravity, corruption, and wickedness is pervasive in the world, even among the places designed to alleviate the symptoms of oppression. And Solomon's solution to those abuses is to rest in the God who judges the righteous and the wicked, the one who sets the world in right and puts the world right and puts everything in order, to trust in his wisdom and his power and his love. Those are the solutions to the problems that plague us all. And God is able to, Solomon said, make everything suitable and beautiful in its time. The portion of text that we read stands in contrast to something that he said earlier in the book, that we are to take pleasure in all of our labor as the gift of God, to enjoy the fruits of our labor. And he's now drawing us to the person who's incapable of taking pleasure in their labor because of these oppressive systems that are in place, the people that they have to work under, and because of general lack of contentment. And so Solomon says something that Job complained about in his soliloquy in chapter 3. You know, the person that's never been born is better off than everybody that's currently alive and experiencing all the evils in the world. And this is one of those things that young families often confront in the decision to bring a child into the world. We've all heard families have this conversation. I just don't know that I want to bring a kid into the world right now in the condition that it's in. It's a value, an underlying belief that many people hold. They're better off having never been born than to come into the world and to see and experience all of the evil and all of the atrocity. And he says, you know, there's no one to comfort them. The powerful oppressing the weak is a common theme that's found in Scripture. Oppression of the poor and other evils that are perpetrated on human beings in the name of privilege and power. That is one of the reasons God's anger was aroused against entire nations. Aside from idolatry, injustice and the cry of the poor roused God to anger. And God dealing with these systems of oppression that was fresh on the mind of Mary in the New Testament. When Mary learned that she was going to give birth to a child and call his name Jesus, in her Magnificat she cried out, God has scattered the proud in the thoughts of their hearts. He's brought down the mighty from their thrones and exalted those of humble estate. He's filled the hungry with good things, and the rich he sent away empty. They had this idea in their mind at the time when Jesus was announced that God was going to overthrow the systems of oppression. And there would be this great reversal of misfortune in life that has been perpetrated on them by the powerful. Oppression is one of those evils repeatedly denounced in Scripture, particularly through the prophet Ezekiel and Amos. The most famous city guilty of oppression of the poor and the needy was Sodom and Gomorrah. A lot of people read Genesis 19 and assume that they were overthrown for some sexual sin. But Ezekiel tells us the reasons why they were overthrown. The real indictment against Sodom was not some sexual sin, though that was a part of it. It was because they had an abundance. He says in Ezekiel chapter 16, verse 48 through 50, that Sodom, she and her daughters had majesty, abundance of food, and enjoyed carefree ease, but they did not help the poor and needy. That was the great indictment against Sodom and Gomorrah. Oppression, violence, bloodshed. And God said Jerusalem was worse than they were. That was Ezekiel's address to Jerusalem in Ezekiel chapter 16. They were the unfaithful bride of the Lord. And it turned freely away from the gifts that God had brought into their life. They were sacrificing their children and built these elaborate structures to showcase their wealth, and they played the prostitute with other nations, and the abominations they committed against one another were greater than anything God overthrew Sodom and Gomorrah for. They made Sodom appear righteous and would ultimately fall under God's displeasure and judgment. And what it boiled down to is the way they dealt with the people that were brought into their life. There is a gentleman that stands on the corner every time we go to our daughter's house in Winsville. We get off at the Great Summit exit, and I know before I get to the exit there's going to be a gentleman there. And I'm reaching in my pocket to get what I have. We really need to have some bags put in our cars for these reasons of just some basic things like water and stuff like that. And I know not everybody would agree with it, but I'm like, $5 is not going to harm me, but maybe it'll feed him. You say, well, what if he uses it on drugs? That's none of my business. This guy has reminded me of my humanity, and I do everything I can to look at him in the eye and to notice him and to observe him. And God uses that guy to spring me from the prison of myself. So I don't mind giving him $5 and saying, God bless you. I hope your day gets better. My life is infinitely better than his right now. I can't imagine what I would do if I was in his situation. One way to rise above the systems and structures that facilitate oppression is to not participate in them. Think about the Good Samaritan. The priest walked by and did nothing. The Good Samaritan, who was considered an enemy at the time of the people, they did not get along. People would go all the way around just to avoid having to cross into Samaria. The Samaritan is the one that stopped and took care of the man that was beaten and left for dead on the side of the road. And Jesus commended the Samaritan. The other reasons he gives in the chapter is envy and a lack of contentment are competing factors that drive us to madness and chasing after the wind. We get this glimpse of that hard work is a good thing. Solomon believes that industry is better than idleness, but industry also brings a whole train full of anxieties as well. And so he says, better is a handful with quietness. Better is a little than a whole abundance, than a whole handful with travail and vexation of spirit. Why is this so? Because they're not content. These competitive spirits drive all of these pursuits. This is Solomon's way of describing somebody who's just working to keep up with the neighbor's possessions. Endless pursuits creates vexation of spirits. Industry is better than idleness, but if it's done simply to keep up with your neighbors, it is its own form of self-induced oppression. It is a curse in itself. The person who works for these reasons alone, Solomon says, they're never going to be able to take pleasure in their labor as the gift of God. Instead, they're cursed by it. They forfeited contentment in the pursuit of things that they thought would make them happy. And you forfeit contentment because of envy. It's preferable to being a workaholic who's never satisfied with what they have, or an impoverished sluggard who sits with their hands folded in their lap and just does nothing at all. He says, no, industry's a good thing, but learn the secret to just being content. And then the last thing he hones in on, one of the last things, is loneliness. It's another reason why it's hard for anybody to take pleasure in their labor as the gift of God is they've got nobody to celebrate with. Kind of alienated themselves from community and healthy relationship. They got no friends. They hide in their work and they become the center of their own existence. And this activity makes for a very lonely existence, and it lacks all the typical things that bring us all meaning and value and purpose in life. In verse number 8, Solomon seems to be describing this person who sacrificed human relationships in the interest of work and possessions, and later realizes, I've got nobody to celebrate with. I've got nobody to enjoy the fruit of all this labor with. And so he says, two are better than one. Part of the essence of what it means to be a human being is to be in relationship with other people. God said in the beginning, it's not good that man is alone. Have some friends, make some friends, build relationships with people. There are only certain types of people in the world, too, that are gifted for celibacy, but even then, they don't live in isolation. Monks live within a community, right? Two are better than one. If you fall down, one will pick you up. Basic human needs for safety and wellness are found in community. Right? And hidden in this ethic for life is that the person is unsatisfied with what they have. They're not content. They've given into the idea that the best is lived accumulating things, and when being dissatisfied with them, no matter what they have, envy and jealousy energizes this mission to acquire, and they forfeit the best things in life, which is human interaction. Final characteristic he notes here is found in verse 13 through 16. And it's observed in the way we treat those who lead us. In particular, verse 16 describes this scene where a king who was once celebrated by the people is now treated with contempt. And now they're tired of him, right? They've grown weary of this guy. And they slight the king, and they praise the new one. And the main idea, again, is just a general lack of contentment. They look to leaders to make them happy. And once they get tired of one leader, they just move on and embrace a new one. And the chapter ends with this endless cycle of rifling through people who they think is going to make them happy and bring them up to a certain standard and quality of life. And what happens in the process is those relationships of trust between leaders and followers is fractured because of a general lack of contentment. Confidence in leaders, looking for happiness in them, is misplaced. In placing confidence in leaders to make us happy and satisfied is very transient. But satisfaction and happiness is available. Where do we find the source of it? That's the key question in the verse. With all of this poetry that he talks about here on what drives a lack of contentment, we're led to see at least that the best things in life cannot be oppressed, purchased, acquired, neglected, or easily written off. The greatest means of happiness in life and contentment is found in the people that God brings us into our lives. Sometimes those that we take for granted. It's the relationships we neglect or fail to enter into, or the people that we walk past on the street with a smug indifference and accuse them of just being a lazy bum. Or the leaders that we look to and trust to help us to get from point A to point B. These people matter for our happiness and our satisfaction. And the way we lift and love one another is a key to satisfaction and happiness in life. To value the people that God brings our way makes it possible for us to take pleasure in our labor as the gift of God. Because we cease looking at each other as competition, as a means to an end, and instead we stop seeing each other as an adversary, but rather an ally in life. That is my understanding of Ecclesiastes chapter 4, is that the people matter. The people that God brings into our life randomly, the cashier at the grocery store, the waitress, the guy on the street corner, your neighbors, your family members, your friends, your co-workers, those people matter in your life, and how we treat them directly impacts our own well-being. It's no wonder Jesus summed up the entire law with one verb: love. Love God, love your neighbor. On these two things hang all the law and the prophets.
Amen.